The Third Reich built its empire on a foundation of steel, terror, and an ideology of absolute ruthlessness. Its generals were masters of the blitzkrieg, architects of a brutal new order. When they were finally captured, they expected the same cruelty they had inflicted upon the world. But America had a different kind of weapon in its arsenal, one they were completely unprepared for. It wasn't a tank or a bomb. It was a clean uniform, a warm meal, and a simple question: why? By April of 1945, the 1,000-year Reich was breathing its last, suffocating in a tightening ring of Allied steel. For the high command of the Wehrmacht, the architects of conquest from Poland to the shores of France, the world had been turned upside down. For 12 years, they had been indoctrinated with a potent narrative of their own superiority, a cultural and martial invincibility that had shattered against the industrial might of the United States and the unyielding resolve of the Soviet Union. As their fronts collapsed and their Führer retreated into a fantasy world beneath the streets of Berlin, these men faced a terrifyingly simple reality: surrender. And in their minds, shaped by years of their own regime's brutality and Joseph Goebbels's venomous propaganda, surrender was synonymous with death. They had seen the newsreels, both real and fabricated, of what happened to captured German soldiers on the Eastern Front. They knew the orders their own units had carried out against partisans and prisoners. They had been taught that the American soldier was a gangster, a degenerate mongrel, undisciplined and motivated only by greed and revenge. They were told to expect the worst: a roadside ditch, a summary trial followed by a rope or a bullet in the back of the neck. This was the logic of total war as they understood it. It was a mirror image of the cruelty they themselves had institutionalized. So when the moment finally came, in a muddy field or a shattered German town, as they handed over their ceremonial sidearms to young, weary-faced GIs, they braced for the inevitable. Each captured officer, from the decorated general to the hardened colonel, stood stoically, a mask of grim acceptance hiding a primal fear. They waited for the butt of a rifle to the face, the shouted command, the final ignominious end to their careers and their lives. But the blow never landed. Instead, something profoundly unsettling occurred. An American captain might approach, not with a pistol drawn, but with a tired, almost businesslike demeanor. A young private, perhaps only 19 or 20 years old, would offer a pack of cigarettes. A canteen filled with clean water was passed around. These were not the actions of vengeful barbarians. They were small, almost mundane acts of humanity that struck at the very core of the general's worldview. This initial contact was a form of psychological disorientation. For a man who had commanded panzer divisions and orchestrated the movements of tens of thousands of soldiers, to be offered a simple kindness by a supposed subhuman enemy was an event that defied all logic and training. It was the first crack in the ideological armor that had been forged over a decade of Nazi rule. They didn't understand that this wasn't random compassion from a few good soldiers. It was the quiet, unannounced beginning of a deliberate and sweeping American strategy. A strategy that aimed not merely to defeat Germany on the battlefield, but to wage a second, silent war against the very ideology that had fueled its aggression. As they were organized and led away from the front lines, a deep confusion began to replace their fear. They were prisoners, stripped of their rank and their pride, but they were still alive, and they were being treated not as monsters, but as defeated soldiers. The war of bullets was over for them. A far more insidious war, a war for their minds, had just begun. The journey away from the collapsing front was a blur of cratered roads and hollow-eyed civilians. Herded onto trucks, the captured officers were driven west, deeper into the Allied logistical machine. Their destination was the French port of Le Havre, a city battered by war but now buzzing with the immense, orderly energy of the American military. Here, the sheer scale of the operation began to dawn on them. This was not the improvised chaos of a failing army. It was a testament to overwhelming power, thousands of men, mountains of supplies, and a fleet of ships that stretched to the horizon. They were no longer generals commanding armies. They were merely entries on a shipping manifest, part of a vast transatlantic conveyor belt of defeated men. They boarded the vessels that would carry them to the New World, Liberty ships. These were not grand ocean liners or menacing warships. They were humble, mass-produced cargo haulers, the workhorses of the Allied supply chain. Crammed into holds hastily converted to carry human cargo, the German officers found their conditions Spartan but survivable. There were bunks, sanitation facilities, and perhaps most importantly, there was order. The American guards were not brutal thugs. They were efficient, distant, and professional. Their job was simply to transport their cargo, and they did it without malice or fanfare. This professional indifference was, in its own way, more unnerving than open hostility. Hatred would have validated their importance. Indifference suggested they were irrelevant. As the coast of Europe faded into a gray smear on the horizon, the true psychological campaign began. Day after day, a routine settled in. 3 times a day, they were given meals. The food was simple but plentiful, a stark contrast to the meager rations they and their men had been subsisting on for months. They were issued blankets against the cold Atlantic nights. And then there was the coffee. For men who had spent years drinking Ersatzkaffee, a bitter brew made from roasted barley and acorns, the taste of real coffee was a profound shock to the system. That simple, hot, dark liquid served in a metal cup was a more potent symbol of American strength than a squadron of bombers. It spoke of a nation so rich, so untouched by the war's deprivation, that it could afford to serve a luxury item to its captured enemies. Each sip was an admission of defeat, a taste of a world they had completely underestimated. The long days at sea became a period of forced introspection. Stripped of their uniforms, their staff, and the familiar structure of military command, they had nothing but time and the endless gray expanse of the Atlantic. The consistent, humane treatment gnawed at them. It wasn't mercy as they understood it, a whim granted by superior. This felt systematic, calculated. It forced a deeply uncomfortable question into their minds. If the Americans were not the monsters propaganda had claimed, then what did that make the regime they had served? If their enemy could afford to be magnanimous in victory, what did that say about the moral and economic bankruptcy of the Third Reich? The journey across the ocean was a slow, deliberate erosion of their certainty. The waves of the Atlantic were washing away the foundations of their ideology, leaving them adrift in a sea of doubt. They were heading towards an unknown fate in America, but they were already prisoners of a new and powerful idea, that their conquerors might win not just by force of arms, but by force of character. The first sight of land was not the smoldering ruins they had left behind, but the impossible, vertical spires of New York City. For men who had seen Europe's ancient capitals reduced to rubble, the undamaged skyline piercing the clouds was a vision from another world. It was a silent, towering declaration of victory, a testament to a power that had projected its might across an ocean while its own heartland remained untouched and unscathed. As they steamed past the Statue of Liberty, a symbol they had been taught to mock as a hollow promise of a decadent culture, it now seemed to stand as a solemn, unyielding sentinel, guarding a continent of unimaginable wealth and strength. Their processing was swift and impersonal. Disembarking, they were moved to facilities like Camp Shanks, a massive staging area just north of the city. Here, the German command structure, which had persisted in a ghostly form on the ships, was finally and completely dissolved. They were no longer generals and colonels. They were serial numbers. They were deloused, given fresh American-made clothing, and cataloged with bureaucratic efficiency. This process, devoid of any personal animosity, was yet another psychological blow. They were being handled not as worthy adversaries, but as a logistical problem to be managed. From the coast, they were put on trains and sent deep into the American interior. The long journey by rail was a rolling panorama of their defeat. They looked out the windows not upon a nation strained by total war, but upon a landscape of serene prosperity. They saw neat farmhouses with painted fences, bustling towns with streets full of automobiles, and vast open plains of grain stretching to the horizon. Every mile of track clicked away another piece of the Nazi myth of a decaying, inefficient America. Their destinations were places with strange foreign names: Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Camp Concordia in Kansas, Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma. By the war's end, the United States was operating a vast network of such facilities, holding over 370,000 German prisoners of war. When the generals arrived, they found not the barbed wire hellholes of their propaganda, but something that resembled a meticulously organized, if Spartan, small town. The barracks were simple wooden structures, but they were clean and orderly. Latrines were sanitary. They were issued freshly laundered uniforms, a small but significant restoration of dignity that stood in sharp contrast to the rags their own soldiers were wearing in the final days of the war. Critically, everything was run by the book, specifically the book of the Geneva Convention. This was the masterstroke of the American strategy. The humane treatment was not an arbitrary choice left to individual camp commandants. It was official, codified policy. Regular meals were provided, ensuring every prisoner received a daily calorie count that many German civilians back home could only dream of. Medical and dental clinics were available, staffed by professional doctors and dentists. An officer suffering from a chronic ailment received better care in a Mississippi POW camp than he could have in a Berlin hospital. This systematic adherence to international law was the most potent weapon of all. It demonstrated that American strength was not just industrial or military, but moral. It presented a system of values, of laws that applied even to one's enemies, that was the polar opposite of the Nazi creed. The camps were designed to be a crucible, a controlled environment where, stripped of the pressures of combat and the constant reinforcement of propaganda, the prisoner's ideology would be broken down by the steady, relentless application of decency. Life inside the wire settled into a monotonous but stable routine, a stark departure from the existential chaos of the front. This very stability was a key element of the psychological campaign. With their physical needs met and their survival no longer in question, the prisoners were left with an abundance of one thing: time. Time to think, to reflect, and to confront the chasm between the world they had been promised by their Führer and the reality they were now experiencing. The camp environment itself was a silent rebuke to their ideology. The neat rows of barracks, the well-maintained grounds, the very absence of casual cruelty, it all served as a daily, unspoken counter-narrative. The American guards, for the most part, were not the vengeful caricatures from propaganda posters. They were often young men from the Midwest, professional and detached, enforcing the rules with a calm authority that was more disarming than any physical threat. For the German officers, who were products of a rigid, hierarchical system built on fear and dominance, this lack of overt intimidation was deeply confusing. They had been masters of a system that equated kindness with weakness. Yet here, surrounded by the overwhelming power of their captor, they were met with a disciplined restraint that felt like a different, more confident form of strength. This constant, low-level cognitive dissonance began to work on them. Small conversations with guards, observations of the camp's efficient administration, the simple act of receiving mail from home through the Red Cross. Each interaction chipped away at the certainties that had defined their lives. They saw that the American system worked, and it worked without the need for the brutal coercion that was the bedrock of National Socialism. It was in this carefully controlled environment that many began to truly grapple with the nature of the regime they had served. Freed from the immediate pressures of loyalty and the fear of the Gestapo, they could finally ask themselves forbidden questions. How had a nation of such supposed cultural and military genius been so thoroughly defeated? How could an enemy portrayed as so weak and decadent be so powerfully organized and morally self-assured? For many, the conclusion was inescapable and deeply unsettling. One prisoner famously wrote that this American mercy was a far more effective weapon than any physical abuse could have been. Torture would have hardened their resolve, validated their propaganda, and allowed them to see themselves as martyrs. Kindness, however, left them no enemy to hate, no injustice to rally against. It turned their anger inward, forcing them to confront their own complicity and the bankruptcy of their cause. The Americans had effectively weaponized the Geneva Convention, turning an instrument of humanitarian law into a tool for ideological deconstruction. They were demonstrating, through their actions rather than their words, the fundamental difference between a society governed by law and one governed by the will of a single man. The ultimate goal was not just to hold prisoners, but to begin the long, arduous process of denazification, one mind at a time. The battle was no longer for territory on a map, but for the moral landscape of the German soul, and it was being fought not with artillery and bombs, but with clean sheets, regular meals, and the crushing, undeniable weight of civilized conduct. While the majority of prisoners were held in standard camps, the highest value officers, the generals, the scientists, the intelligence specialists, were destined for a more specialized form of confinement. Their journey ended at a secret location hidden behind a simple mailing address: Post Office Box 1142, Fort Hunt, Virginia. Cloaked in secrecy and ringed by forest, this facility was the nerve center of American military intelligence's effort to extract the secrets of the Third Reich from its most senior leaders. Here, the art of interrogation was refined into a science, but it was a science that rejected the crude instruments of torture and coercion. The architects of Fort Hunt operated on a revolutionary premise: that a comfortable man with a full stomach and a willing ear to listen to him was far more likely to yield valuable intelligence than a man broken by pain and fear. When a German general arrived, he was not thrown into a dungeon. He was shown to a private room, often furnished with a bed, a desk, and a chair. He was allowed to keep his uniform and insignia, a calculated gesture of respect for his former rank. The interrogations themselves were masterpieces of psychological subtlety. They rarely took place in a sterile, intimidating room. Instead, they were framed as polite conversations, often held in a comfortable office, sometimes over a shared meal or a pot of fresh coffee. The interrogators were the facility's true secret weapon. They were a hand-picked cadre of American officers, many of them German-speaking academics, lawyers, and intellectuals. A significant number were themselves Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany. These men possessed a profound, intimate understanding of the German mind, its culture, and its vanities. They could discuss philosophy with one prisoner, debate military strategy with another, and talk about classical music with a third. Their approach was not to break their subjects, but to befriend them. They would listen for hours to a general's justifications, his complaints about Hitler's strategic blunders, or his boasts about his division's triumphs on the Eastern Front. They created an atmosphere of intellectual respect and camaraderie, skillfully manipulating the officers' egos and their desperate need to be seen as professional soldiers rather than Nazi ideologues. This soft approach was devastatingly effective. Feeling respected and understood, the generals let their guard down. They would correct an interrogator's mistake about a panzer division's strength, inadvertently revealing crucial data. They would sketch out diagrams of new weapons systems to prove a technical point, or describe the inner workings of the German High Command to showcase their own importance. All the while, hidden microphones recorded every word, and teams of analysts worked around the clock to piece together the intelligence puzzle. Fort Hunt proved that information extracted through trust was infinitely more reliable than information extracted under duress. The program was a resounding success, yielding a treasure trove of intelligence on everything from U-boat tactics and V-weapon development to the political rivalries within Hitler's inner circle. It was the ultimate paradox. America's most humane prison was also its most productive intelligence operation, demonstrating that the greatest secrets could be unlocked not with a fist, but with an extended hand. Beyond the specialized interrogations at Fort Hunt, the broader camp system was designed not merely to contain, but to cultivate. American leadership understood that these hundreds of thousands of prisoners would one day return to Germany, and they would play a role in shaping its post-war future. The camps were therefore transformed into vast, unintentional universities of democracy. Instead of being left to stagnate in idleness and resentment, the prisoners were encouraged, and in some cases required, to create a structured civil society within the confines of the wire. This was a radical departure from the punitive logic of imprisonment. Prisoners were allowed to organize their own cultural and educational activities. Orchestras and choirs were formed, filling the quiet American nights with the music of Bach and Beethoven, a poignant echo of a culture they were now forced to re-examine. Lecture series were established where officers, many of whom were academics or professionals in civilian life, could teach subjects ranging from engineering and literature to philosophy and history. These intellectual pursuits provided a vital distraction, but they also served a deeper purpose. They gave the men the mental space to engage in the critical self-reflection that was the ultimate goal of the program. Newspapers were printed and circulated within the camps, written and edited by the prisoners themselves under the watchful, but generally light, censorship of American authorities. Debates flourished on the pages of these papers. For the first time in over a decade, these men were in an environment where differing opinions could be expressed without fear of a midnight visit from the secret police. They argued about the causes of the war, the nature of their government, and what it meant to be German. This structured, intellectual environment created a crisis of conscience for many. Day after day, they lived in a system that was orderly, fair, and humane. They were treated with a respect that their own regime had denied to millions. They were allowed intellectual freedom that had been extinguished in their homeland. The contrast between this reality and the brutal anti-intellectual world of Nazism became impossible to ignore. For a general who had stood on the parade grounds at Nuremberg, mesmerized by the spectacle of absolute power, the quiet dignity of a prisoner orchestra playing Mozart in a Mississippi pine forest, was a profoundly subversive experience. It suggested that German culture could exist, and even thrive, without the jackboot and the swastika. The American strategy was one of patient, psychological horticulture. They were not trying to violently uproot Nazism, but to create the conditions in which it would wither on its own. By providing security, purpose, and a forum for free thought, they allowed the prisoners to deconstruct their own ideology. They were being re-educated, not through overt propaganda lectures, but through the lived experience of a more civilized way of life. They were being shown, not told, that a society could be strong without being brutal, and ordered without being oppressive. Each concert performed, each lecture delivered, each newspaper printed was another small victory in the quiet war for Germany's future. The final act of this psychological drama began in the spring of 1946. With the war in Europe over and the Nuremberg trials rendering their stark judgment on the Nazi regime, the process of repatriation commenced. For the German generals and their fellow prisoners, the journey home was the mirror image of their arrival. They boarded the Liberty ships not as conquered warriors shrouded in uncertainty, but as men profoundly changed by their captivity. They had spent a year or more in a nation that had defeated them utterly, yet treated them with a calculated decency that had systematically dismantled their entire world view. They were returning to a home they could no longer fully recognize. The voyage back across the Atlantic was a time of quiet apprehension. They knew their country was in ruins, but the reality was still a shock. As their ships docked in shattered ports like Bremerhaven, they were met with a landscape of almost biblical devastation. The great cities of Germany, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, were vast wildernesses of rubble, their skeletal remains a testament to the totality of their defeat. This was the final, brutal lesson. The prosperous, untouched America they had just left stood in horrifying contrast to the wasteland their own leadership had created. The victors were returning to thriving farms and humming factories. The vanquished were returning to starvation and rubble. The starkness of this comparison cemented the strategic lesson that had been taught in the camps. The American system had not only outfought them, it had outlasted them, outproduced them, and ultimately proven itself morally superior. As they made their way through the ruins, searching for families and fragments of their former lives, they were confronted with the true cost of the ideology they had served. The promises of glory and a 1,000-year Reich had led to this. A nation on its knees, occupied and ashamed. The humane treatment they had received in America now seemed less like mercy and more like a final, devastating judgment. It was a demonstration of a power so confident in its own values that it had no need for the petty cruelties of revenge. It was a victory not just of arms, but of an idea, the idea that a society built on law, dignity, and restraint is ultimately more resilient than one built on terror and tribal hatred. For many of the repatriated officers, this experience was transformative. They had been captured as servants of a totalitarian state and were returned as reluctant pupils of democracy. While not every mind was changed, the seeds of a new perspective had been planted in thousands of influential men. They had been defeated twice, first on the battlefield by American industry and valor, and a second time in the quiet barracks of Mississippi and Kansas by American decency. This second victory, though silent and largely unseen, was perhaps the more enduring of the two. It was a quiet masterstroke of psychological warfare, a final, irrefutable argument in the long and bloody war of ideas.